I'm Nick Knudsen, joined by Will Miles. Welcome to Stand Up and Holler. On this episode, Patrick Toney heads for the NFL with the Arizona Cardinals. Napier doesn't waste any time, hires Austin Armstrong as defensive coordinator. William Peagler and Kiri Colbert headed to the NFL as well. And we'll wrap up by discussing Stricklin's comments on Ben Hill Griffin Stadium renovations. First off, we'll jump right in here with two pits with Patrick Toney leaving. Bruce Feldman tweeted earlier this week, sources say that Patrick Toney is leaving UF to join Jonathan Gannon's staff with the Arizona Cardinals. The 32-year-old Toney is regarded by many coaches as one of the game's sharper young defensive mind. ESPN first reported the move. Toney is moving from Florida after just a single season. Lots of success at Louisiana, 23-2 during his stint at defensive coordinator there. He was only 30 years old at the time of his promotion, something to keep in mind for Forbits. Napier released a statement saying, "We would like to congratulate Patrick Toney on his new challenge and opportunity in the National Football League." Napier told the Tampa Bay Times, "PT has been a pivotal part of our success over the last 5 years. He has set a great example and been a relentless worker and learner. He is a selfless teammate and one of the finest coaches and teachers we have been around. We are forever thankful for his contributions to our teams, and we wish him and Courtney well as they continue their journey." So despite Toney's accolades coming into Florida, the Gators really struggled in his only season. Of course, he inherited a defense that has been struggling for a couple of years as well. Important to keep in mind. The Gators did rank 11th in the SEC in scoring defense, allowing just over 28 points a game, and 12th in total defense, close to 400 yards a game. They allowed 30 or more points in 6 of its 7 losses. So not a great single season that's going to go down in the history books for Patrick Toney. He was certainly one of the storylines heading into 2023 on what he can do with the defense, and as he got more pieces in that he had been recruiting. So definitely a loss for the Gators here early on heading into spring ball, but certainly one season. There's not a lot to say one way or another right now because it wasn't pretty last year, Will.
No, it was a dumpster fire. I mean, look, so Toney's defense was worse than any of the 4 seasons that Todd Grantham had at Florida, and it wasn't particularly close. He was 105th in yards per play last year. The worst that Grantham was 82nd in 2020. He was 98th ranked in yards per rush. The worst that Grantham was 85th. He was 103rd in yards per pass. The worst that Grantham was 85th. He was 91st in yards per game. The worst that Grantham was 83rd. He was 20th in takeaways. That's the only reason Florida even had a shot in some of those games. So that was better than Grantham. He was 129th out of 130 teams in third down conversion. So third and Grantham really transferred over to third and Toney. He was 87th in points per game allowed. The worst that Grantham was 72nd. And it just keeps cascading. He was 93rd in the country in 20-plus yard plays allowed. He was 96th in sacks and 74th in tackles for loss. He was, like I said, he was 87th in red zone touchdown percentage. They gave up just a boatload of explosives. Their predicted points added was 0.22, which actually is a little bit better than Grantham's 2020 year. So from an advanced statistics perspective, they were a little bit better, but only 14% havoc rate, which was lower than any of the havoc rates that Grantham had in any of his 4 years there. So we came into 2022 thinking that Patrick Toney had to be an upgrade because he was replacing Todd Grantham, and it turned out that he was worse than Todd Grantham. And so that thing that you were reading where it said he is thought of as one of the of a rising defensive mind, we'll see, right? I think this season is really a black stain on that. And look, I mean, if he turned it around next year as defensive coordinator at Florida, he's probably looking at a defensive coordinator job in the pros or a head coaching job at the college level. And so to take a job with Arizona as a safeties coach indicates to me that there might have been a little bit of mutual separation in some respects here, where Florida, would have kept him if they had the opportunity to, but if he had an opportunity to jump, weren't necessarily going to throw a bunch of money his way to make it happen. And this is a pretty big miss for Napier. I mean, the idea that he brought that he brought Toney from Louisiana. He was the coach he targeted. Obviously it had a lot of success on the defensive side of the ball there at Louisiana, but Florida's a different kind of pressure cooker, right? And it felt like as the pressure got ratcheted up, the team didn't get much better as the season went along. And, you had the dismissal of Brenton Cox, and you had some other things where some of the young guys weren't getting the run maybe that we thought they might. And so, we'll see. I don't have any inside information here, but just the way it sort of appears, the timing, all that sort of stuff, the fact that he's not going to become a defensive coordinator in the NFL, but he's actually taking what some would consider a step back to be a safeties coach. And then the fact that, if the justification is you don't want to deal with recruiting anymore, well, when you're a 33-year-old guy who was brought in, thought to be a dynamic recruiter, that explains some stuff about why Florida may be struggling on the trail. So look, wish him well. I hope he does well at Arizona, but there's nothing to say about his tenure at Florida other than it was a significant disappointment.
Yeah, and he's definitely a guy of all the staff you look at. He's the guy that you really had circled in year 2. And like you said, pressure cooker, man. This year, if the defense puts together a performance anywhere close to 2022, that would have been a rough look for him this next season. And there might not be a 2024 if it's another season like it was last year. So, hey, look, I'm disappointed too, because I thought that certainly a lot of hype coming in, but it is 1 year. It's 1 year. You inherited a defense that was not great before you got here. Did you do anything to improve it though last year? And you look at it, certainly statistically, you just read it all off. No, you did not. But here's my question, Will. How much of what he wants to run were the players in place? How much of those players were in place last year to where he can really run the defense the way he wanted to run the defense? Because that's what I was looking forward to in 2023 here. You see, they got to build their roster a little more, much more of Napier's players, much more guys that are going to kind of fit that system a little better in 2023. Unfortunately, we're not going to get to see chapter 2 of the Patrick Toney story at Florida.
Maybe a little bit. I don't think it's a coincidence that Florida has a bunch of guys going to the NFL. And that from a defense that was as bad as Florida was statistically, the fact there's a bunch of guys from that defense who've been invited to the combine, I think speaks poorly to the ability to adjust to your players. And, that is your job as a coach. Your job as a coach is to put your players in a position to succeed. And if those guys weren't able to do it, then you need to replace them. They had plenty of guys from their recruiting classes or guys that they had decided to stay. Kamari Wilson didn't necessarily play at least a ton until later in the year. Obviously, Devin Moore played pretty early, but you recruited Jalen Kimber through the transfer portal, and Kimber wasn't a starter throughout the entire season. So, I think some of it can be attributable to players. I think some of it can be attributable to coaching. But, I'll tell you, it's interesting because I really had some reservations about Toney after the Florida State game. And you and I were texting back and forth after the first drive, and I was like, he didn't watch the film. Because you can see where Jordan Travis struggled and where he didn't struggle on tape when you went back and looked at some of the games where Florida State had struggled, especially early in the season. And when Travis had started to pick stuff up, and when you played aggressive man-to-man with single high safety, he was able to take advantage of that throughout the year. And that was what Florida came out in that Florida State game. And, it's not a surprise. Florida gave up more than 40 points. Now, look, maybe they could have played zone and would have given up 40 points anyway. But Travis is and you do need to change up your defense, but they basically didn't change it up. Every time they got in the red zone, they brought extra guys. They tried to bring pressure, which wasn't something they've been able to do all year. Travis escaped and just killed them on runs where they were in man-to-man coverage, and the defensive backs all had their backs turned. And that was something that I pointed out in my preview that I thought they needed to do, that they needed to get away from. And the fact that they didn't make an adjustment in multiple games where there were opportunities to make adjustments, I just looked at it and said, you know what? Look, he knows more football. He's going to forget more football than I know. But when you see something like that on tape where you go, Travis struggles in this circumstance and doesn't in this other circumstance, and you decide to go out and run your scheme and decide to run the thing that you think your players are good at rather than adjusting to the opposition, I think that suggests a stubbornness maybe that, and look, his system has worked at Louisiana, right? And he's grown up with that system and he knows what he wants to do. And perhaps he's also sort of proving a point to the players who are there saying, you're going to have to play this thing. And it would have been nice to see another season with the, with Napier's players and Toney's players, but we won't get to do that. And, we'll see with the new guy coming in.
Yeah. I'm disappointed we're not going to see season 2 here, but Napier wasted no time in making the replacement hire, hiring Austin Armstrong, recently hired to Nick Saban's staff as the inside linebackers coach at Alabama. He's only 29 years old, and he's now the youngest defensive coordinator at the Power 5 level. So once again, Napier has no fear to hire a young guy. Hey, how old was Napier when he got his first offensive coordinator job, Will?
I don't know, but it didn't go real well.
About 27, right? It did. He also had, I think the first year it did anyway up at Clemson. He set all kinds of records that first year, and then the second year not so well. But yeah, I'll say this: probably a reason why Napier's not afraid to hire the young guys, right? He himself got an opportunity pretty young. So Armstrong connection with Napier, 2 different stints at Louisiana while Napier was there. First as a graduate assistant in 2018, second as the inside linebackers coach in 2020. In 2019, he was a defensive quality control coach at Georgia, working closely with current Oregon coach Dan Lanning on a day-to-day basis. Defensive coordinator for Southern Miss for the last 2 seasons here, 21 and 22. This past season, the Eagles tied for 4th nationally in sacks with 44. In 2021, his first year at Southern Miss, they were one of the most improved units in college football. The Golden Eagles improved from number 60 to number 42 in total defense, and they finished 2nd nationally in first downs allowed and 6th in red zone defense. So certainly some good indicators there from Austin Armstrong, but also another situation here where you're bringing in a very young coordinator, definitely someone that must be thought of pretty highly if Saban's running out to get him too. I think it's something where it's again difficult to read on this here. Not a lot of resume to go off of, but Napier clearly thought enough of him and thinks he's ready to get the job to go out and make the hire.
Yeah, I mean, so look, I think there's some good things here. I think you look at him taking over Southern Miss in 2021. I actually don't think he made the defense that much better. They went from 83rd in yards per play in 2020 to 98th. So they actually got worse in terms of the statistic. I think is probably most important, at least a raw statistic. What they did do was they improved from 84th in takeaways per game to 8th. And so one of the reasons that you see that total defense stat much, much better is because they were able to take the ball away a lot more. Well, we just sort of saw that with Patrick Toney, where Florida was able to take away the ball, but didn't get a whole lot better in other areas of the game. Now, okay, in the second year, they went from 98th to 51st in yards per play. The turnovers dropped a little bit. The big thing there, though, is that sacks, they went from 90th in the country in 2021 to 4th in 2022. Tackles for loss went from 85th to 3rd. So if I'm looking at something that, hey, we struggled with pressure last year, that's a place where Armstrong is probably going to make a big difference. Now, I don't particularly like this hire. I think, I think the phrasing I used before we came on was I hate it with the heat of 1,000 suns. That's a little bit of hyperbole, but I don't particularly like it. And the reason why is that if you actually look at the advanced statistics, the havoc, which is essentially tackles for loss, turnovers, or pass defense, was 21% and 14% for Southern Miss before he got there. It was 19% and 18% in the 2 years after he got there. And so if you're looking at those sack numbers, they don't really track with the havoc. And then when you start looking at the explosive plays, they were 80th in 2021 at giving up 20+ yard plays. They were 114th in 2022 at giving up explosive plays. And so they were getting a lot of sacks and a lot of turnovers, but then they weren't stopping anybody any other time. And so that, I think, is concerning when you consider where Florida has been really over the past 5 or 6 years under Grantham. So one of the really nice stats I like is explosive pass predicted points added, which if it's up over 1.5 is bad, right? And so Florida in 2018 was 1.63, 1.49 in 2019, 1.6 in 2020, 1.57 in 2021, and 1.64 in 2022. Florida has struggled to stop teams from getting explosive plays in the air now for half a decade. And now you're bringing in a guy who has a profile, at least when he was at Southern Miss, that suggests he's going to struggle to prevent that big play. What I really think these stats are indicating is that he will bring extra guys to get pressure on the opposition, and bringing those extra guys exposes his defense on the back end. So if Florida has the cornerbacks and the safeties who can hold up in coverage, and they can spring some of these linebackers. They're bringing in, guys like Deuce Spurlock and Jaden Robinson and Taraja Mitchell and those sorts of guys can find the creases and get in there. They're going to make some big plays. But the question is the offense going to make big plays when they go the other way? I suspect, given the talent that we have on the defensive side of the ball, that it's going to be a very much feast or famine defense. You hear all the time people talk about bend but don't break defenses. This is a break and don't bend defense. You're breaking it in one direction or you're breaking it in the other, and that's what shows up in the stats. That actually is the same general profile that we saw with Patrick Toney last year, and in some ways that's kind of the profile that we saw with Todd Grantham as well. So, oftentimes when you see teams go from one coordinator to another, or even when you see programs go from one coach to another, you'll go from like a disciplinarian to a guy who's a player's coach or vice versa. This isn't going to be a culture change. There's going to be some continuity by bringing in Armstrong here. That's maybe the thing that you like. But the thing that I don't like is I look at the things that everybody pointed out when he came in, when Armstrong was hired, where people say, hey, this is going to be, look at this, the sacks and the tackles for loss and things like that. And I go, yeah, but what are you giving up on the back end for doing all of that? And I just look at, I go, you're going to give up a lot. So the idea that, a couple of years ago when Florida was blitzing from Micanopy and guys were running wide open down the field, I think that's still a distinct possibility. Now, look, Armstrong's 29 years old. He probably learned a lot when he was at Ole Miss, or I'm sorry, Mississippi, at Southern Miss.
Southern Miss.
And I'll screw it up again before we end here.
I got you.
But, I'm sure he learned stuff while he was there at Southern Miss. And so the question is, what did he learn and what can he do with better athletes? And, we'll see. But again, I think based on what he wants to run, it's going to be a very similar defense to what we saw schematically from Patrick Toney, which may be good, maybe bad, but at least the guys who were recruited for it are going to fit. But,
right. So look, how big is that from a player standpoint? Because you're not going to bring in a coach who's going to completely overhaul the defense. And then we're in year one again on the defensive side of the ball, especially with a unit that struggled so badly in transition last year. To if we brought in a completely different system again this year, you're talking about starting over from scratch essentially on the defensive side of the ball for a second year in a row. So
yeah, but in some ways,
that's got to be big for the continuity of the players.
I guess in some ways you're starting over from scratch anyway. When you think about all the guys who left, all the guys who transferred, you think about, the fact that you've got Graham Mertz on the offensive side of the ball with Anthony Richardson probably going to the top 15 picks of the NFL draft, given all the noise out there about that. So 2024, I think people already look at, and in fact, we see this with like the numbers of people who listen and read and all that stuff, that the enthusiasm around the program is waning a little bit. And I think part of that is because people have relatively low expectations for 2023. Napier's make or break year is going to be 2024, right? He's going to have DJ Lagway in. He's going to have Miles Graham in. He will have had a full year with whoever he picked as defensive coordinator to come in and turn things around. We'll have had a whole nother recruiting cycle to bring in more of his guys, that sort of stuff. So, I think from the standpoint of if you were going to say, we need to make a change and we need to make a schematic change or we need to make a philosophical change or anything like that, this would have been an okay time to do that. The continuity just means you don't have any mistakes if you're still terrible. Now, I think the thing is that defenses don't stay this bad, right? I mean, even the Florida defense in 2021 was way better statistically than it was in 2020. Now, it had its warts. And in fact, most of the stats I look at and I cited ignore the Samford game, which most of the time you put a team like Samford against a Power 5 team and all the statistics skew in a way that makes them look better. You put the Samford game in and all of a sudden Florida's defense looks way worse just because of the way they played in that game. So I'm not saying 2021's defense was great, but they were 39th in yards per play overall, dropped to 105th in 2022. I kind of expect them to end up kind of in that range. If you look at defenses, so in 2018 and 2019, I looked at some defenses earlier this year who had a major drop on one side of the ball or the other. So basically 50 plus spots for brand new coaches who were coming in. It almost always happened on the other side of the ball. So if you were an offensive coach who came in, the defensive side of the ball is the one that had a giant drop. If you're a defensive coach, the offensive side of the ball is the one that had the giant drop. Of those 8 coaches, there's an average improvement of 62 spots in yards per play. So that would put Florida at 43rd nationally. So I think they will actually probably be a pretty decent defense next year. I think we're going to look at Armstrong and go, look at what he did. He was able to improve things. Now, 43rd on defense still doesn't get you very much. I mean, it gets you maybe 8-4 in a best case scenario. it's not a fantastic defense, but it's enough to keep you in games. And so I think things are going to improve next year. But whether that's because of Armstrong, I think that's going to be the metric that I look at. If he gets them into the top 20, then that's something that Armstrong's done. If they sit there somewhere between 40 and 50, I go, that's just kind of regression back to the mean, given the talent level that Florida has on the roster. And then I'm not necessarily singing his praises. So I think we need to set expectations appropriately, where expectations should not just be, well, Florida was 105th in yards per play last year, so if he improves them to 70th, that's an improvement. And hey, woo, way to go, Armstrong. I think we need to be in those 40s before we're saying, all right, he did what he was supposed to do. And then if he can get him into the 20s or the 30s, then you say, hey, that's a good job. That guy came in, did a really nice job.
29-year-old Austin Armstrong, the newest defensive coordinator, and Billy Napier at the University of Florida. Let's move on to 6 bits here. 2 other assistants have also left the Gators. Tight end coach William Peagler, 37-year-old. He is following Toney to Arizona. He will take a role with the Cardinals on the defensive side of the ball after only his 3rd year on the field as an FBS assistant coach. Of course, he arrived at Florida after serving as Michigan State's running backs coach in 2020 and 2021. Additionally, according to multiple reports, Kerry Colbert will join the staff of Sean Payton with the Denver Broncos as their new receivers coach. Though he played in the NFL from 04 to 11, this will be his first coaching job with the NFL. Actually played very briefly with the Broncos. Napier hired Colbert from USC after the Clay Helton staff was let go, but Colbert did a great job at USC, mentoring guys like London, Amon-Ra St. Brown, and Michael Pittman Jr. now with the Colts, all 3 solid NFL receivers. So a little disappointing in that one, Will, because there is a promising group of wide receivers coming in here as freshmen. They had to have been drawn to that receivers coach as part of their commitment. So a little disappointing to see him go on that, but you certainly understand that with the opportunity in front of him. And Peagler at 37, the jump to the NFL as a young guy like that, you get the opportunity to go with Toney. I guess Toney might have put in a good word for him or whatever, but Peagler's been at a lot of different places. Knows Napier from his Clemson days, did a stint with Napier at Louisiana. He's been all over the place. So this is just a young guy that strikes me as he gets an opportunity to go get some NFL experience. So, I mean, both guys getting into the league, not many coaches are going to say no from jumping to college to the NFL anyway. So certainly good opportunities. But, man, all these coaches getting hired in the NFL, and Anthony Richardson's going to be a top 15 pick. Well, if you would have told me that from the offensive side of the ball in August, I would have guessed that we had an incredible year on offense. But, certainly a little odd. Certainly a little odd to see 3 coaches in a couple days end up heading out to the NFL.
Yeah, I mean, I think Colbert's the one that hurts. He's making an upgrade, going from Gators wide receiver coach to Broncos wide receiver coach is an upgrade for his overall career. Good for him, right? I mean, but he's also the guy who's done a really nice job on the recruiting trail. I mean, you think about Gene Wilson and Mizell coming in this year at the wide receiver position, and all of a sudden, and Caleb Douglas was pretty good last year as well. So brought in some really good players at that position, and it's a shame he won't get a chance to coach him, but I think he's earned the ability to go to where he needs to go, or go to Denver based on what he did at USC and based on what he's done at Florida. Florida's receivers were actually pretty good last year. They started to really feel the depth issues once Justin Shorter went down, and then Jaquavian Frazier's got hurt, and Xavier Henderson got hurt, and all of a sudden you're out there with younger guys who have to step up. You got Dejon Reynolds going for like 200 yards against Vanderbilt, but Dejon Reynolds was ready, right, when they called his number against Vanderbilt. I think that's a reflection on Colbert and his ability to coach. I think Peagler's one of those where I'm sort of like, if you ask what did he really do well, I mean, we heard a lot about Dante Sanders during the offseason, and then Sanders was okay. Obviously Zipper got injured a little bit, showed something out there, but nothing where I looked at it and said, oh, he's fantastic. And then at the redshirt freshman level, you got Arliss Boardingham, Hayden Hansen, Tony Livingston, and it sounds like Andrew Savigny may move there as well. Nobody of note at the tight end position in this most recent recruiting class. So what are we really losing, I guess, is the question. If we didn't see significant development at the tight end position, and then if we haven't seen significant results on the recruiting trail, again, they haven't really announced where he's going on the Cardinals, but they've said he's going to go to the defensive side of the ball. So to go from a tight end coach to an NFL defensive position coach, okay, we'll see. I mean, it sort of depends on what your goals are career wise and things like that.
Yeah. He's under 40. Get some experience in the NFL. You can come back. I mean, this is only his third. He just finished his third season as on the field coach. He was most of his career has been spent behind the scenes and working as quality control and grad assistant and stuff. So
Yeah.
he gets the opportunity to jump to the NFL, get some more experience on his resume. He can come back and probably command almost any college job he wants after that.
Yeah. Now, the one thing I will say is, if you remember, I think it was after the 2019 season, Todd Grantham had an opportunity to go to the Bengals. And Florida decided, or Dan Mullen decided, that he was going to pony up and pay Grantham a ridiculous amount of money to come back. This is kind of the same thing when you think about Patrick Toney, you think about Peagler, even Colbert. You look at that and go, if Billy Napier really wanted to get those guys to stay, one, with the departure of some of those guys, there's salary freed up to really reward the guys who maybe want to stay. And the other thing is that, you clearly, Florida has the ability to do that. They've done it in the past. The fact that they didn't do that here, I do think says something. I think Colbert specifically probably wanted to go to the NFL regardless, but for Peagler and Toney, I think they probably could have sweetened the pot to keep them. And for everyone who got upset about Dan Mullen not letting Todd Grantham go, after 2020, in some ways that was probably tied to the amount of money that they had committed to him, and the fact that they had, just honored him by saying, we're going to keep you away from the Bengals by enticing you to stay here. They didn't decide to do that here. So the criticism can't be that you can't make hard decisions, because you had to make a hard decision in some ways to let these guys go. Now, obviously, the guys you're going to replace him with have to be better. And that's, now that you've got those funds, you've saved those funds up and you negotiated to have high salaries for your coaches, you're going to have to go find guys who are out there who are better. Hopefully Armstrong fits that role. And hopefully some of the guys that they have promoted into these positions for Peagler and Colbert fit that as well.
It's a good sign when people want to hire your coaching staff. If we're having this type of turn, you look at Alabama and Georgia, what they deal with turnover every year. If we get to the point where we're dealing with turnover with our coaching staff due to being hired by outside external forces, I think that's a good sign for the way Billy Napier's selecting assistant coaches there. Will,
I mean, I would agree if these guys were all making upgraded moves, right? I mean, if Toney was going from Gators defensive coordinator to Cardinals defensive coordinator, you said congratulations. Like Grantham was going to go be the Bengals defensive coordinator. Like that is a upgrade considering you're going up a league and you're maintaining that same coordinator position. When you go down to a safeties coach, or when you switch from a tight end coach to say like a cornerback coach or something like that, I don't know what Peagler's going to end up doing. Those are at best lateral moves, and in some ways even a downgraded move. So I do think you need to analyze that when you say, guys are going to the NFL. But yeah, obviously you'd rather have your coaches be in demand than have people go, we're not going to touch that guy. He's going to go, coach at Troy when he's done with when you finally decide to fire him. He's going to take a year off and then go coach at a Division II school or something like that. We've seen that with other coaches who, when they get fired, don't get picked up anywhere else. And so, it's good to have your guys in demand. Same thing as it's good that Florida's going to have all these guys drafted. The problem is at some point the coaching staff and the players have to put all of that NFL potential on the field in Gainesville, and we'll see. That's what Napier's going to be judged on.
That's a good way to put it. All right, let's move on here to Dollar. Talk about those swamp renovations earlier this week. Athletic Director Scott Stricklin appeared on the Steve Russell Show on WRUF 8:50 a.m. in Gainesville. Discussed some major upcoming renovations for the Ben Hill Griffin Stadium. He called it the largest renovation project in SEC history, perhaps, and maybe even nationally. He's aiming for this to be a 75-year fix, not a 10 to 15-year fix. So he's talking the whole structural, really. There's a lot of space within the building. All the old weight room and locker room stuff under the south end zone, they're going to try to repurpose some of that space throughout the stadium and make it more fan friendly. He's saying there's also office spaces in there where a lot of the UAA works. in Ben Hill Griffin Stadium there that he's talking about repurposing as well. So they originally announced the plans to upgrade back in October 2021, and this comes from Brandon Carroll at Sports Illustrated. Florida is working through two separate studies, including an initial overview of the renovation process before recently finishing a honed-in version of the plans. Stricklin said, "We have a pretty comprehensive long-term vision, and we want it to be the iconic football stadium that everybody thinks of, that's better than ever, and it's going to be around for a long, long time." So, Will, it sounds like huge plans for Ben Hill Griffin. It sounds like it's coming in the pretty near future. He also did casually mention raising hundreds of millions of dollars for this project. So this is going to be there. It sounds like they're in the planning stages here. They're wrapping up the planning stages, and we should see plans sooner than later, it sounds like. But you look at it, there's a lot of stadiums across the country are going through these challenges. You look at a school like Florida, I wonder what percentage of Gator fans are driving in from 2 to 3 hours away to go to these games. You talk about Orlando, Jacksonville, and Tampa. How many people are coming in the day of the game and making that kind of effort? Why should people get off their couch and come into the swamp when they got their beautiful big screen TVs at home and they could just sit home in their comfortable houses watching games all day? It's a great experience on TV. So they're coming up with different ways. A lot of sports, not just football, not just college football, are dealing with this dilemma right now, and that's certainly at the forefront of the decision making behind this project right now. Will.
Yeah, I mean, it's interesting. I don't know that I've ever gone to the stadium and wondered why don't they make it a better experience, other than maybe a little bit better cell service. That's always the thing that you're missing when you go there. Your battery drains as you're searching for the ability to text or something like that. But in some ways, that's actually a good thing that I enjoy. Right, you go there and you have to enjoy the game as opposed to just being on your phone the entire time. Look, I think every stadium is going through this. Every program's going through this. Certainly the student section has been empty for some of the games that, that have been less important or have been less sort of, circle everything. But there's something special about having, 96,000 people in there for that Utah game this year. And that overhead shot that they got for the Utah game where you could see like the little specks of red over in the corner and then completely surrounded by blue everywhere else. Those are really cool. And I think they got to be careful that they don't lose that. I've never come to the Swamp and been like, wow, I wish there was something majorly different with the stadium. I'm sure there are people who feel differently. And I'm sure people who go to NFL stadiums all the time, and that's not me, but I'm sure people who go to NFL stadiums all the time notice that there's a difference in quality in terms of where you're sitting. But again, I think to me, a lot of the value of going to the game is going to the tailgate beforehand, is seeing all your friends and all the things that you have that have nothing to do with the actual game on the field, but that the game is bringing you all together to then do that. And so if you improve the stadium, okay, great, but that doesn't improve the experience all that much for me, because the experience, it has something to do with something that has nothing to do with really like the quality of the experience of watching the game, other than the electricity when it's a big game on campus is palpable and everybody enjoys that. So I don't know. I do wonder whether they're sort of looking at the symptom of maybe less people coming to the games and fan interest and people staying home and watching on TV, and whether they're misdiagnosing the disease, right? I'm not sure that the disease is necessarily the lack of amenities in the stadium. I think in some ways, if you make the overall fan experience better for the entire day when people are there, then you're going to end up with more people coming to the game. And whether that means you just say, look, we're going to have less students and we're going to sell those tickets to alumni, or whether it means you lower the overall cost of tickets, or you start allowing people to bring their kids for a reduced rate, or whatever that is. Like, I'd much rather have it be cheaper to attend and be able to bring my sons than some souped up thing that costs a lot more money and I have a more comfortable seat. But again, I'm one person. I'm sure they've done marketing studies on what people want and are following that to make these decisions.
Yeah, there's different aspects too. And I know they did I'm probably going back about, are we going back 20 years on all the the skyboxes up there? Well, so we're going back a ways on that now too. but there's a big difference between sitting in the skybox and even just kind of a club level, right? So that I feel like that's kind of lacking in the Swamp right now. You talk about you go to stadiums like in Tampa and Jacksonville, they got great club level sections. I know Jacksonville has actually gotten rid of some seats to enhance that, to create some, areas where businesses could buy in, and there's more open areas where people can stand and watch the game and everything. So there's different viewing experiences that you could probably create there. I'm kind of with you though. I'm not sure if the Swamp desperately needs that, but better to be ahead of the curve than have to play catch up like we are with facilities right now, about 10 to 15 years too late, right? So it's great that we're finally doing it, but I'd rather be ahead of the curve than behind the curve. And one of Stricklin's one of his strengths too, he's always been a good fundraiser too. So if he can pull it off and he can get it done, certainly we're entering an era too where I don't know how much with the Florida law now, the fundraising is going to fall on within the school now for NIL stuff versus externally. I'm not sure how much they're going to be involved in the fundraising aspect on the NIL side now too, but I'm sure they got a lot. If they're going to do this on top of all the NIL stuff, they got a busy stretch coming up, man.
Well, I mean, that's where this is a little bit odd, right? Is after the fiasco with Rashada and all the other things that have sort of gone on with NIL, a couple of recruiting classes that quite honestly have been lackluster, to then come out and say, hey, we're going to spend hundreds of millions of dollars on facilities improvements, when facilities improvements are not, like, the fan experience is not going to bring better players to Gainesville. And so it is an interesting juxtaposition, because if you want to improve the fan experience, be 12-0 or 11-0 when Florida State comes to town. Mm-hmm. That'll improve the fan experience considerably. And if, and same thing, if you want people to travel to bowls and all that sort of stuff and be engaged in the program, and I experienced this when I went to Florida, right? My freshman year, Billy Donovan had come in, and then the year where Florida played Mateen Cleaves and Michigan State in the final championship game of the NCAA tournament was my freshman year. And so right at the beginning of the year, nobody went to the games. You could just show up, flash your student ID, walk right in, and you could do it at the O'Connell's, and you could go into the O'Connell Center and watch the game. By the time the end of the year came, no, they were handing out tickets. You had to get tickets beforehand, and the place was packed every time because they were good and they were winning. And the experience of watching a team go all the way to the Final Four and then get to the championship game meant that people were invested, not just that year, but then the next year, even though Florida wasn't necessarily able to reach those heights the next year. And I think to me, that's still everything. Is the fan experience is tied to winning and having hope that your team's going to give you the ability to brag for the rest of the week. Because I still think back to the LSU, I want to say the first game I went to after I got out of college, and I went with some of my family members. The first game I went to with my dad was the LSU game where Tebow throws the jump pass, and Florida wins the national championship that year. And so that's my memory of going there with my father and seeing a team that could win the national championship. I've seen Percy Harvin play. I've seen Tim Tebow play. I can look back on those sorts of things. The 2018 squad, I went and saw him play at Tennessee, and Freddie Swain catches a long pass from Felipe Franks. I'm not going to remember that 10 years from now. I mean, I'll remember going to the game. I don't know that I'll remember the players' names when it comes to that point, just because, and I'm certainly not going to remember it like I do the Tebow jump pass, because the winning makes a difference. And so, look, I get it. I understand that your job's to fundraise, that the alumni in many ways and the boosters want amenities and those sorts of things. But there's only one way to really improve the fan experience, and that's to start winning. So whatever it takes to get that on the field, if this helps out with that, then great. If this hinders that, then I think you need to take a step back and reevaluate, because 11-0 going into that game against Florida State in the Swamp, there ain't anything better than that. And so if you have an ability to feel the buzz on campus when you have an undefeated or a chance to go play for the national championship by beating your main in-state rival, there's nothing better than that. And that's the thing I hope that they're focusing on.
Well, that's it for this week's show. We'll be back next week with another episode of Stand Up and Holler. For Will Miles, I'm Nick Knudsen. Have a great weekend, everybody, and go Gators.
Go Gators.
Thank you for watching this episode of Stand Up and Holler. Be sure to subscribe to the Read and Reaction YouTube channel. Join our Patreon community at Read and Reaction for bonus content each week, and check out our website at readandreaction.com. I'm Nick Knudsen. joined by Will Miles. And as always, go Gators.